Hello and welcome to today's session. Digital Dialogues is a series of panel discussions exploring civil society's perspectives on the emerging digital world. Today's theme is the relevance of digital corporate responsibility for non-profits, for civic tech and wider civil society organisations. In the commercial world, we often hear about digital corporate responsibility as companies grapple with how their digital practices affect people, communities and the planet. These discussions span a wide range of issues, including data privacy, cybersecurity, the ethical use of technology, digital inclusion, accessibility, environmental aspects, as well as transparency, accountability, and tackling digital harm. But what does this issue look like for civil society? Civil society organisations have long been active on defending privacy, advocating for rights, promoting access and inclusion, holding powerful actors accountable, and supporting communities affected by harm. This is and should be no different in the digital realm. So what are civil society organisations already doing in practice when it comes to digital responsibility? Do civil society organisations need clearer and more defined strategies on this responsibility? And how can CSOs balance this dual role as both users of digital technology and advocates for a stronger digital rights, for regulation and accountability in the wider ecosystem? We will be discussing this and more in our dialogue today. To guide us through today's session, I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to our three expert speakers. So Suchi Gar is the Senior Director of Strategy and Operations at World YWCA. Neil McCarthy, Associate Director of Rights in a Digital Age at Oxfam, and Nambali Nkosai, who's a social impact strategist. We will drop the extended bios of all of the speakers into the chat when they start talking. So to start us off today, each panellist will have 5 minutes to introduce themselves, to frame the issue and to give some key points. We'll then have some time for the participants and panellists to discuss among themselves, and we'll get on to your questions. So please do remember to put your questions into the chat and we will try to get to as many of them as we can later in the session. So let's start us off. Suchi, would you please turn your camera on and join me on screen? And don't forget to begin with a self-description. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Suchi Gaur. I'm joining from my home office, which is based in Amsterdam. I'm originally from India. I'm wearing a brown top with a brown golden scarf, and I'm wearing glasses, and I have black hair. So thank you once again for having me here. I want to start with a question which is, what is the opposite of artificial intelligence? Natural stupidity. And sometimes, honestly, that feels like the risk we have in front of us. Digital systems that are supposed to make us smarter, make us more efficient, make us more systematic and better able to advance our mission are often approached without ethics, without responsibility, without safety, without people and context at the very center. We're not moving with progress. We are actually, in that case, heading towards a chaotic world. In my job as the Senior Director for Strategy and Operations at World YWCA, I see this deeply related to everything we do as a social movement. The conversation matters extremely well, not in just light of doing programmatic work or doing mission work or doing capacity building work or doing advocacy work, but for us, it's very much the fabric of what we are trying to do as a social justice movement. From the perspective of World YWCA, we work across diverse contexts, from young women to women of other ages, to communities and movements. We are navigating inequality, violence, we are seeing shrinking civic space and exclusion. And in that reality, digital choices are never just technical choices for us. They're never just technological choices for us. They're choices that can shift power, trust, safety, participation, harm. So for me, the relevance of digital corporate responsibility in my role is in the way that I see in the civic society, it is not mainly about importing private sector language and kind of personalizing it into our work and just adopting it. It is about giving a sharper structure to those language pieces, asking the right questions of how do we adopt it, and how, as we do that, how do we operate? Who gets included? Who gets excluded? Who carries the risk? Who gets to decide what is being adopted, what is being done with technology, and what happens when things go wrong? Who takes the burden? So I'm going to talk today about just three principles that are very, very important in the work that we do at World YWCA. One is do no harm. We often apply this not just in a global context, in the civic society space, we apply it very well to programming and partnerships. But to me, digital application of do no harm principle as a structure is very, very important. If we are using digital tools to organize, to deliver services, to engage communities, to collect data, to communicate across whole of our movement and our networks, then we have to not only ask questions of whom is this tool useful to, but whether if these tools are safe or not. And safe for whom? Who is taking the risk if something goes wrong? We know risks are not equally shared. We know that harm often falls on those who are dealing with structural inequality. Young women, activists, organizers, and communities which face surveillance, harassment, exclusion, they are often at the worst receiving end of these problems. So in such a space, how does a technology impact, people that we work with, people that we work within as a community? Even, given the work we do as a feminist and women's rights movement, the very people who are doing this work globally are at such risk of harm at a global space because of the way that digital spaces are operating. So for us, open source solutions are a very, very important aspect to the work that we are trying to do currently at World YWCA. We are looking at those as a solution to ensure that not just the design of everything is in our control, but the safety of people who use our technologies and systems, including our team members who are spread across the world in different geographies, their safety is at the front and center of the design thinking that we bring into this work. The second principle we have is co-creation and people-led systems. Now, digital transformation is treated as a tool, as a question of tools and platforms very often. But for civic society, we know that this is shaped by people, not just rolled over to them. We don't bring in a technology by our wisdom, sitting in our, technology assistants, having a technology group come in and design it. We do not do that. We have a technologies first group that works with us and the team that works as a facilitator and then includes other team members, other community members, other local movement members as YWCA into the very design thinking of the process of what we are trying to build. I do not think that smart systems are not smart if they don't reflect the language needs, the safety needs, the access needs, the technology access needs, safeguarding concerns, and even local contexts of people. So people need to be very much in the center of it. And the third point I want to talk about is innovation for us means so much more than technology. And this can be not just looking at experimenting with technology, but very strongly looking at procurement, safeguarding, data practices, staff capacity. I want to talk about just one more example before I close, which is a group of young women that we work with in India who are deaf young women. They're using one of our tools which centers young people, centers communities, centers people into the very design thinking of it, merging it with ChatGPT and Indian Sign Language to make lives for themselves easier to do social justice work. What we are trying to talk about is placing dignity, placing people, placing safety, inclusion, doing no harm at the very center of bringing technology. And that, to me, is what World YWCA thinks of when we talk about digital social responsibility. Today, the question is not whether digital social responsibility is relevant or not. The question is whether we are willing as systems and as organizations to treat it from a lens of integrity, to treat it from a lens of systems change, to treat it from a lens of How do we do our work of doing the mission work better by centering digital social responsibility across the system, not just in one or two operational and policy processes? So thank you.
Thank you, Suchi. You can turn off your camera. I'd like to welcome Neil McCarthy to join us now on screen. Good afternoon, good morning, Neil, I think for you. Please do start with your description and your opening inputs. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. I'm Neil McCarthy. I'm a middle-aged cisgendered man. I have pale skin with a lot of freckles that likely reflect my Irish heritage, although I now live in Canada and I'm joining you today from my own home office. I wear dark-rimmed glasses over my blue eyes and I have short stubbled hair on my head and a trimmed graying beard. I am wearing a blue shirt and I have a headset on my head with a microphone extending. And I am delighted to be with you all today. My own background is in both technology and human rights, and I've been at Oxfam since 2009. In case you're not familiar with us, Oxfam is a global organization that fights inequality to end poverty and injustice. We seek to confront the daily consequences of poverty and injustice, but we also seek to end the global causes that create and perpetuate poverty and injustice. And digital technology is increasingly part of that analysis of both causes and consequences. For some of my time at Oxfam, like my colleagues, I worked in operations deploying technology that would advance our mission. But about 8 years ago, I moved over to the impact and partnership side of our work, and I currently co-lead Oxfam's Rights in a Digital Age initiative. The initiative is based on our policies. We have a set of about 40 policy statements that articulate our vision for what a rights-respecting digital ecosystem for all would look like. These include policy statements around digital access and equity, security and digital civic space, data protection and privacy, automation and the future of work, and digital governance. So my focus is on supporting our country teams and their partners in the regions. We work in 76 countries in total to add a digital rights analysis to all their program design. Borrowing from our gender justice colleagues, we want to both mainstream digital as an issue, but also do standalone digital rights programming where possible. And my other focus is in surfacing what they learn in the global spaces where Oxfam engages, both with government and intergovernmental groups, civil society peers, but also the private sector. Maybe to explain that, we recognize that the experience of any citizen in the digital world is influenced by many factors. Some are hyper-local, like gender norms in a specific context or how far you are from a cell tower. Some are national, such as internet shutdowns and privacy legislation. And some are global, such as the platforms that we all use and the companies that provide them, and also just, the rules of the internet. So we're intentionally trying to act both locally and globally in this work, addressing digital rights harms in the context wherever the leverage point exists, either locally, nationally, or globally. And I can give some examples in the chat later on. And we may get into this more deeply later on, but if we are to collectively realize the rights respecting digital ecosystem to which we all aspire, we also then have to lead by example, which will mean aligning our behaviors with our ambitions. It's not always easy to do that in an increasingly resource constrained context. The obvious example right now is AI, but this also applies to our existing technology platforms and investments in the portfolio of systems we have. I personally believe, I'm not a Luddite, I personally believe we have a moral responsibility to utilize any emerging tech if it will make us more effective and impactful. But we also have to think about the externalities that such technologies create and continue to expand in their of. And those externalities are to people, to communities, and to the planet. And the most obvious example is the harvest reaped by social media. We simply don't have the luxury of following that trajectory again. So action, and particularly coordinated collective action, is needed. And I think we'll get more into that conversation about collective action as our discussion continues. On a final note, I'll note one other connection. I'm also on the board of nethope.org. If you don't know about NetHope, I'll put a link in the chat. NetHope is characterized by the collective power of our members, both collective thought and collective design work, as well as collective action, and in some cases, collective procurement. At the moment, over 60 civil society organizations are members, large INGOs, and many private sector partners, particularly in the tech sector. But NetHope's newest strategy explicitly includes more pathways for civil society actors of any size to engage, particularly through the Connectors program. And we're doing work to help our members and partners collectively tackle some of these issues. And I can give some more examples of that later on as we have time. Back to you,
Wonderful.
Rachel.
Thank you so much, Neil. You can turn your camera off, and I will now invite Mbali to turn on her camera and to start with her opening inputs. And again, please remember your self-description. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, everyone. I'm actually pleased to be here and to be part of this panel. I am Mbalenhle Nkosi. I'm wearing a grey sweater with a black top underneath. I'm wearing glasses, maroon glasses, and I've got short black hair. I am a Black African female. For the last 15 years, I've been working in civil society in the nonprofit sector, primarily, focused on strategy, execution, digital systems innovation, and operations at scale across nationally as well as internationally. So over the last 12 months, I've been an independent consultant, a social impact strategist in the nonprofit sector, also working with corporates, primarily in the mining sector, under the corporate social investment pillar. And my work over the past years basically has been focused around, being more practical, although being systems orientated, bringing a systems orientated perspective on digital corporate social responsibility. So yeah, that's been me in a nutshell in the last 16 or 17 years, actually going towards 17 years, but the last 12 months have been basically consulting with the private sector as well as civil society. And what I'd like to talk about today is three aspects. The first one is digital corporate responsibility and the ethical use of tech at grassroots level. And whilst I'm from South Africa, in Johannesburg, South Africa, I forgot to mention that actually at the beginning, my apologies. What we find is that we face a significant digital inequality. There's inequality obviously between, in the rural areas and the urban areas and the likes. And ethical digital engagement means ensuring technology does not exclude those with limited connectivity and digital or digital literacy. We must start, obviously, with acknowledging the fact that there is a digital divide in our context. Ethical engagement means designing technology that works for communities with limited data, older devices, and inconsistent connectivity. This is something, obviously, that we need to start with and acknowledge that before we even go ahead with anything else that we'd like to address as it relates to the ethical use of tech. Collecting data, obviously, working at community and at grassroots level, collecting data must follow ethical standards. And in South Africa, we are governed by the POPIA Act, which those from South Africa and others might be aware of. The communities or the people that we are collecting data from must know that their data is going to be used and how it's going to be used. So consent must be clear. It must be meaningful. And ethical technology basically is about communities should be partners in the process of data collection. They should know, they should be involved. And it's not just a tick box exercise where we basically signing, do you give consent? But they need to know, they need to understand how and where their data will be used. And also have access in terms of how they can use that data so that they can also make, if they need to use the data for themselves. We need to see technology as a tool for inclusion and not basically an extraction. So we're not just collecting and extracting the information that we need, but it needs to be inclusive of all the parties that are involved, and particularly at grassroots level. That also means co-designing tools with the communities in mind, with them being involved in the process, providing feedback, using digital tools to empower the local voices. And now we're also at a time where everyone is going AI, algorithm, and what does that look like at grassroots level? Whilst we use AI in community engagement, we're finding discrepancies in terms of language exclusion and cultural misrepresentation. So, in our context, obviously in South Africa, if AI tools don't understand isiZulu, isiXhosa, isiSotho, and the many other official languages that we have, can we claim to be representing the communities that we say we are engaging? I think that's something that we need to be pondering on. And my previous experience, my recent experience at Grow ECD, we had we were rolling out a Grow mobile app at grassroots level for community members who were operating and running early childhood development centers. That app obviously required personal information from the owners themselves. So I speak in that context because as much as those that are more literate in terms of tech literate and just literate in general were able to navigate and use the app and understand where that information that they were capturing on the app was going. But for those that weren't so literate, found themselves basically capturing information blindly, naively so, and not even knowing how or what the data was going to be used for and where it's going to be stored and for how long. So those are the things that we actually have to take into consideration, though we might take it for granted and take it lightly, but there are aspects that we need to take into consideration as it relates to actually breaking it down to make it clear and understandable at grassroots level so that everyone is part and parcel and is basically seen as a partner in the process of the exchange of data. I think my last point that I'd like to talk about is basically transparency. What transparency looks like in our context. I mean, we've had historical issues that relate to governance, governance related issues, and transparency because of that has become more critical at community level. It's not just voluntary, basically volunteering disclosure. No, it has to be part and parcel. It's basically like critical, as I mentioned, at community level. Transparency isn't just good governance, it's a mechanism for building trust between the institutions and the public that we are serving and that we want to amplify the voices of. So access to information must be understandable and easy to use. And I think the last point that I wanted to mention is that transparency and accountability are not abstract governance principles. They are practical tools for strengthening democracy, restoring trust, and ensuring that digital transformation benefits everyone, not just the connected few. And true accountability happens when transparency enables participation, when citizens cannot analyze information, but cannot just analyze information, but also act on it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mbali. I will now invite Neil and Suchi to turn on their cameras and join me on the screen. And we'll spend a few minutes with the panelists diving into the intersectional aspects of their inputs, drawing out a bit more detail. So do any of the panelists have questions or reactions to what you've just heard?
I think we're all waiting for the others to go ahead. So much politeness. I mean, I think the fascinating question that we're all dealing with is this idea of aligning our procurements or our usage of technologies with our values. And I guess my question for both of you in your role in operations, for you, what's the biggest risk in doing that, in aligning your procurement with your values? And are any of those risks actually opportunities that we could explore?
I can go. There are many, I think there are many challenges and risks that come with it. And one of the risks that comes to my mind immediately is of time and resources. I think when you're doing a process of procurement and you're building in all these values into the very design of the process of procurement, and you're trying to do things right, the pool gets so reduced of people And to actually reach people who are trying to do that, it's still limited. The space is very limited. We have experienced it. And when you're having conversations and you bring these values up, there is like a little bit of pushback. Technology people are still at the same time very well trying to understand how that plays in. So we have to look at procurement consultants as partnerships and bring that. And that's me saying that's the opportunity there to kind of relook at the model of how we are, what's the role we are playing when we bring in vendors, when we bring in consultants, when we bring in groups to do these things for us. Are we just outsourcing the typical old school model, or are we seeing ourselves to play a very, very important part in innovating how that work will happen together rather than pushing it out? So it takes a lot of time and effort and resources. And also takes innovation within the very design of how we are thinking of these partnerships to happen. So that for me is one of the big piece. And the other piece is we are such small organizations and we are resource crunched and we are there's like an overload of work. There's a workflow piece, there's a workload piece. And midst of that, we're trying to also standardize this. So as we are innovating these processes, a big challenge comes in. How do you train everyone around talking about values at the center of procurement? It's not just few team members who are doing procurement. We don't have a procurement departments. We don't have that luxury. So as you do that, I see that as a very big challenge in implementation of these value-based procurement systems within our structures. And that again takes time, it takes effort. And in the middle of all the crisis of the world, in the middle of our strategic plans that we have to implement, it becomes a challenge. How do we see this? As I see it as, in a way, opportunity, I think, is seeing it as a team building, as a realigning, coaching processes again, to relook at how we can come together to do this together as a team. So it's strategic. It becomes strategic then.
Oh, we've lost Mbali. I was about to ask her if she wanted to comment on that as well.
Did you have a question for Neil? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Neil, I know we discussed this earlier, and you spoke about it, but would love to know more about your experience with the advocacy pieces on this. Like, is there even a conversation happening around value-based technology? And you do this work a lot. And what's the what are the hope windows you are seeing within those? What's the hope that we can bang on, and kind of what's the breakthrough into it? Would love to hear your personal reflection on it here.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I do have hope. I think it would be none of us would be doing this work if we didn't have hope at the core of our being. Um, and outrage, I think, as well, is kind of a driving force. When we started the work on rights in a digital age, I think it seemed a bit abstract to folks. I think it's becoming less abstract. I think it's becoming more and more something that we have become conscious of. I think the remarkable innovations that have come out of Silicon Valley in the last 15 years have changed society dramatically. But it feels a little bit like the Wild West. There's a sense that this is inevitable, and certainly not so much the technology that's been created, but the inevitability of how it's run and how it's sustained. And I think there's nothing necessarily inevitable about that. I think we can, as a society, assert what we might want to see instead. Um, I was actually, just a total aside, I was reading a book recently that was um, Ian McEwan's new book, based in the future, 100 years out, and he's all these little comments in there about how society has changed, and it's a remarkable book. But one of the comments that most struck me was this kind of, um, it's a book of fiction, but just these little side notes of, like, back in the day when social media was private and not public. And it was just, that was all it said. It didn't talk about some big mission-driven move to have social media reclaimed as a social space. That's all it said. And it carried so much. And it's like, oh yeah, I guess that's a future that's potential. If somebody can write it in fiction, then it can be made fact. What would that mean, and what would that take, and how would that be done? Um, so I think, having that understanding of what is in the present is important. I think having an ambition for what you want in the future. And for us, our policy framework is that ambition. It outlines what we think a rights respecting digital ecosystem looks like, and it's not technology specific. It's kind of a lens through which we can look at any technology. Um, and then I think it's about mobilization and getting from the current state to the future state. And that is then about collective action. I'll share a link in the chat in a second, but there was a great video just brought out this week about the concept of enshittification, which is a Cory Doctorow coined idea around how, the platforms started off doing something great for us, and then they made those platforms worse to increase their revenue, and then they made the platform worse for their consumers, but made it better for their business customers to make revenue. And now they've made it bad for both consumers and business customers to reclaim the profits for themselves. And that's just the incentives that are in place. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors and their companies and all of that. But the consequences for the rest of us are significantly negative if it's unconstrained. And the announcement a couple of weeks ago that ChatGPT is now running ads just kind of is a signal that we're on that arc already with these new technologies. So I think as we start to think about what that means for us and our decision making, another example, I was on a network working group called this week on AI, and they've started working on this rubric around what an ethical procurement of generative AI technologies might look like, and they're using this PESTLE framework, which stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors. So even just as a rubric for guidance, it's, and NetHope are amazing. Like, the members are all involved in the working groups, but the content that we produce is all public. So I'll put a couple of links in the chat. This rubric isn't done yet, but it's kind of an example of where collective thinking, collective work can benefit everyone in the community. And then it's a case of, notwithstanding all the constraints and certainly the different sizes of the organizations within our sector, we have to lean on each other. And for the bigger organizations, our legitimacy comes from amplifying the voices of smaller organizations. And for smaller organizations, resources that we can make available can maybe help move things forward. So I hope I'm answering the question. I think that there's a collective action problem. It's at the individual level. Certainly, we see that with something like social media. It's very hard to move without moving your community. That's not inevitable. There are different models now available, and I think for us as organizations, there's a collective action problem around, if we were to procure some of these things together, if we were to influence and push the vendors in certain ways, if we were to find other models like you mentioned, Sushi, the open source models like digital sovereignty is a much more is a much bigger movement than it was even 12 months ago. And I think there's lots of reasons for that, but it's a very interesting moment for us to shape the future that we aspire to.
Bali, I'd like to give you the opportunity to ask any questions to the panelists before we move on to our questions in the chat.
Sure, thanks for that. Actually, my apologies, I got disconnected there for a second. Back on now. I've got a question for Neil, actually. How can digital rights policies be designed at a policy level in ways that generally resonate with and are usable by those responsible for implementation?
Great question. If I had the perfect answer, this would be easier. We try to center our policies in human rights. I think human rights is the fundamental common language, I guess, of certainly Oxfam, and I think of our sector more broadly. And so what we intentionally tried to do was partly to make sure that policies didn't expire practically overnight in this world, but also to make them as kind of encompassing as possible. So it serves kind of as a lens through which you can then look at any technology. And I think it's about grounding it in the experience of humans. I think most humans, when they think about human rights, it's easier to grasp if it was happening to me, if it was happening to my community, if it was happening to people that I care about. And so we grounded our policies in that narrative language, and we built honestly on the shoulders of others. We didn't invent many of these policies. We took work that the UN had done, that Human Rights Watch, that Amnesty, that Access Now had done, like really people with much deeper experience in digital rights than Oxfam does. And I think what we're trying to add to the table certainly in our program impact work is the big global footprint that we have. Like it's not just to amplify and echo what someone like Access Now have said and their deep technical experience, but to say yes, and it's happening in all of these 76 countries that we work in. I think your question though was focused on then how do we internalize that and how do we align that? And again, I think the work that our colleagues in gender justice and around the work that's been done around feminist principles within the organization are again a model to follow. I shamelessly steal from them and credit them for this work. But I think internalizing how we behave is all of our responsibility, in the way that we try to model the values of the organization we work for. I think that has to come down into the procurement decisions, the usage decisions, the self-discipline. It's easy to go out and use your private ChatGPT subscription for something, but you're not respecting the boundaries of what the organizational policies are around data protection, the internal security of our own teams, certainly the lives of our partners and the communities that we work with. So I think it is then about, in this unfettered access world, what's the right thing to do, and how do we put in the safeguards for that and the boundaries for that.
Wonderful. Time is moving on, and I see there's a lot of chat and a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to move to some of our questions posed from our participants. A lot of them touch on things that have already been mentioned by all of you. So maybe we could use this time to expand a bit more. So Vidre has asked about AI, which I know all of you have touched on. But Suchi, you were very passionate about this, so I'll ask the question to you. So the question is, development of digital systems and AI is at fast speed. Civil society organizations do not have the required facilities to remain at the same speed of worldwide technology revolution. How do we protect CSOs from being exploited?
I mean, it's a great question. It's a great question. And, I ask, what are we considering exploitation? Like, what are we, why? The whole idea is, while it's running at great speed, do we need to run at its speed? What we need to do in this process of AI adoption and how AI is coming and how there's a fear of losing our jobs and, fear of relooking at things. There are 2, 3 things that are must at that stage that we see as very important. One of which is protecting our values at that piece. As we go into the adoption process, protecting values is extremely important. As we go into the very design of taking care of, oh, we are at threat, but actually seeing it as an opportunity is, how is this going to make our lives easier? How can we become more mission focused as we adopt artificial intelligence? How can we train artificial intelligence into the right ways? And we are, for example, there's a lot of good work that's happening around Drupal, which is a system which helps us set up platforms, and Drupal and open source work around artificial intelligence and building AI bots that can be controlled by humans like us is progressing at a very fast speed. So what we need to do, and in that case, is partner with the right kind of thinking, have conversations in the civic sector to see how we can together create things like these that can help each other. And for me, like, it's one of those examples that comes to my mind when typing was invented. Typing was invented. There was a typist expert everyone had in rooms, right? Like in the room. And we are at that stage right now. People are thinking, oh, there's an AI expert we need, or do we need to bring in an AI consultant to help us? And no, we need to just learn typing. We can't outsource this. We need to look at things like our job descriptions, things like our organizational structures, things like our simple processes, and analyze it from the lens of how this going to be impacted, and have bold, honest, human-centered conversations and dialogues in rooms to try to see, what do we do with this? Now, we can't control everything, I can set up a policy. We can set up a policy in an organization and be like, oh, this is a co-created policy around adoption of AI. We are doing that at World YWCA, not AI specific, but looking at every process and policy and seeing where does AI come in, in a contractor or consultant mandate, or in a workflow conversation? Can we help? How do we integrate these pieces? But also looking at it from a lens of, do we need to? What is it that we can outsource to AI is a very important conversation to happen before you jump into AI. And in that, there is also, and there's a very amazing tech for NGOs person based in US who has no tech experience, like from learning, but is now a tech expert for NGOs. And she says this. And World YWC is trying to do the same logic of, we need to sit down and talk about what is our digital, like, what do we want to do with digital? How does digital fit into our context? And not just go like, oh, we have to do this also, we should automate this and that and this and that. And we have situations where I have team members coming in saying, this is taking a lot of my time and I think I should just sign on to this system. Do we want to go there? Should we say yes to everything? Or should we talk about, okay, let's have a conversation. How does this help? Maybe this is something that looks for the right system. We have a digital adopt transformation plan. Let's build it together. Those are the kind of conversations worldwide WC is having internally right now within the team dynamics, and very boldly in saying we are slow in some things and we are fast in some things. But for NGOs, and we are a small size NGO as well, for NGOs, one of the thing is we have to stop fearing it. We have to see it as, how does this come in? Just like typing did and made your life better. How does this come in? And what elements of our work, our mission work, can this be made better through artificial intelligence? And within that, placing values in every conversation is extremely important. That's the relational piece, which is where I go back to what I said. What is the opposite of artificial intelligence? It's like natural stupidity. Where are we right now in this? Like, are we running after artificial intelligence like stupids, or are we being smart about its adoption and seeing it as a tool and not just thinking of it as to be done quickly, but more smartly? So I can talk endlessly about this, obviously, but we have a lot of good examples of mistakes we have done, of things we are trying to speed up with, and where procurement comes in or policies come in and multiple layers of governance comes in. But there are also amazing things AI can do for us. And it automates systems, but again, it automates systems to help you do your job better, not invent more work to the workload.
Thanks, Suchi. We've got a question that slightly follows on for that and puts it in a bit of a meta, more global advocacy level. So I will address this question to you, Neil. So the question comes from Ryan. It says, if transparency and accountability are central to digital corporate responsibility, shouldn't open and audible systems be the benchmark? And what does this mean for big tech platforms that are built on proprietary code? So not an easy question, Neil, but in the kind of Oxfam global to local, on a global level, what can be done on an advocacy level on this?
It's a great question. I think it's at the heart of what we're trying to get at. So maybe to follow on from what Sushi was saying, I think yes, it's important to adopt and understand and get hands-on and get kind of fluent in how these systems work without necessarily and I guess exploring the limits of what we can do ethically. But I think that there's I guess I think back to what the scientific panel on climate did for our sector. It brought together the best climate minds in the world, and what they produced was the positions that we then took as our advocacy positions. And there is a similar panel starting on AI. It's just been launched, the Global Digital Compact, a year and a half ago. I'm not quite sure where they're at with the recruitment, but they were getting those folks together. Now, the speed with which this is happening with AI, I mean, the speed with which climate is happening is concerning enough. But the climate panel came out with 4 reports over, I think, 15 or 20 years. The AI panel, I think, is going to have to come out with something at a much more accelerated pace, because I do think that what you're getting at, Ryan, in your question around corporate social responsibility is not, I mean, it's only been a couple of years since the AI companies were begging to be regulated. I don't feel like that's their narrative at the moment, but they were looking at the risks that they themselves felt that they were holding, and that the incentives were not in place to constrain them from having to pursue those incentives. It's not that business is bad, it's that incentives are missing. It's that regulation is missing. And I don't think that any of them, I don't think that those who are talking about an existential threat of AI are insane. I don't dismiss that talk at all. I think we're actually doing a paper which will be coming out later this year on AI risks, going from existential all the way through to the less as existential for us as a whole, but very existential for individuals and for societies and for categories of workers. So I think us getting to the point of understanding what this is and what the potential impact is a key part of that. I think the the challenge around even something like proprietary code or big tech platforms, they're a consequence of this being, I talked about it being a Wild West earlier. The Wild West was characterized by the lack of rules. And then the rules came because societies can't thrive like that, can't grow like that forever. And I think the challenge for us and to acknowledge Mbali's heritage as well, like my awakening, I guess, in the social justice sector came from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And that was characterized not just by collective action in South Africa, but collective action globally. I was a young kid in Ireland and I was hearing about grocery store workers who were refusing to handle South African fruit because it was coming from an apartheid regime. And they had a tiny thing that they were part of, but they were on strike for a really long time, like multiple years. A subset of that group came out and they just didn't didn't work because they weren't willing to do that. So I think what the knowledge generation that we can do by this exploration, by looking at what the UN is doing, will do for us is to unlock that collective action. And then I think we will start to see more of those regulations in place and also the correct incentives that would allow technology firms to thrive while not creating externalities that destroy the rest of us. I have there's a former Oxfam colleague did an amazing paper. I'll see if I can dig it out while we're still chatting on donut economics. And the idea with donut economics is that there's a there's a layer, a circle almost, where everybody's doing well. If people are inside the circle, then there isn't enough to survive. But if anyone's outside the circle, then they're consuming too much for the center to hold almost. I'm not explaining it very well. I have to apologize to my colleagues. But there's a digital donut too in terms of digital rights. There's sufficient capability out there for us to figure out how to make the most of these extraordinary technologies in an ethical way, in a way that, it doesn't mean that it doesn't bring about change, but it can be done in a way that allows for just transitions and for everyone to thrive. And I think the companies themselves, in the end, will thrive if those kind of incentives are properly aligned with humanity's future and properly aligned with individual human rights.
Thanks, Neil. We have a question that actually, Mbali, you touched on this already, but maybe you could just spend a short amount of time expanding a bit more. So Namana has asked, how can digital corporate responsibility ensure the inclusion of marginalized groups and communities? And you talked about this a little bit with AI and different languages and a lot of work in your local context in Southern Africa. So maybe you could expand a little bit on that question, please.
Sure. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that digital responsibility has to take the marginalized groups. They need to be at the center. So you can't build or develop anything without them. So having them as part of the process, even initially, as the people that inform the development of whatever tool that you're trying to build, I think that will obviously bridge that gap first and foremost, because then there's elements like the cultural part of it. What does that look like in their context culturally? What languages should you take into consideration? All of those things, and some of them are subtle, you won't know about them until you have them as part of the process. So building with rather than building for, that's the approach that needs to be taken at all times.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question, and I'm gonna be very cruel and say I want everybody to answer in less than 1 minute, so very short. And it is, we've talked about collective and we've talked about how we're all collective on this within civil society. So what would your one priority action be that you think civil society should take to advance digital responsibility in the next few years? Just off, it doesn't have to be the best one, but just one collective action that comes to you now. I will pass to Suchi. You look prepared.
No, I don't. I mean, a lot of things come to my mind, but one collective action for me is it's a transitioning period in the world. There's a lot happening, and I think the one collective action is collective commitment to try to shed ourselves a little and embrace the new, and then come together to embrace that new. Because as the wars, as the world outside, as things are changing and shape shifting, we must also call ourselves upon to adapt and transform. And what that means is letting go of what we have learned a lot and letting go of the expert hat sitting on our head most of the times and trying to look at ourselves from fresh lens and our relationships as civil society from fresh lens and redesigning it. So it's not just one thing, but it's like a process thing. So yeah.
Thanks. And Bali, over to you. Final words.
I would say collective accountability. You know, we're always demanding accountability and transparency from all sorts, like government, all sorts of institutions, the big tech companies. But if we as civil society can actually model what we, not that we aren't, but be more cognizant of that, be considerate of that, and throughout all our practices, we must be open in all our, in all our practices, ethically and otherwise.
And Neil.
I would just say pay attention. I think what we're seeing is a growing movement and a growing awareness that the last 10 years, particularly around the externalities we've seen with social media the most concrete example, I think we're starting to understand what that landscape needs. And I think it's not just nonprofits that will be thinking about their social responsibility and their choices. I think we are starting to see, I hope, the end of the Wild West era. And I think even things like the Global Digital Compact, which every country in the UN has signed, like maybe that suggests that internal layer of the donut, like what's the minimum, and then how do we constrain the excesses and the maximum. So I definitely think as we look in our context, what are those levers for change? And in our collective context, what are those levers for change? I think that'll be the key thing to keep an eye on and see where you can play your part.
Wonderful. Thank you for such concise and insightful ideas for collective action. Sadly, we're drawing the close to this very, very interesting and helpful conversation. And in summary, I've heard so much today, but I've really heard from all of you a lot of consensus around it is about leading by example and having a value-based procurement process. And to be open in our internal organizations about these tensions of the internal decisions we have to make versus the external things that we are advocating for in the real world. And importantly, transparency and accountability is really crucial. And I love what you said in Bali about it's about inclusion and not extraction for the participants and the users and the people that we work with and the communities that we are supporting. So that just leaves me with a chance to say a huge thank you to Suchi, to Neil, and to Mbali for all of your wonderful insights and experiences and ideas. I feel we've all been prompted to go away and think very thoroughly about our own internal systems and the wider way we can all collectively engage and work towards better digital responsibility. So thank you so much for everyone's engagement. Thank you to all of the participants who've joined us online. And I wish you a wonderful end of the day, start to the day for those of you in different time zones. And we will be back again soon with our next digital dialogue. Many thanks, everybody.
vala umlomo ngikaze ngikushiye dali wami